Good morning. Happy Friday. Jimmy Sengenberger filling in one more day for George Brockler here on News Talk 710 KNUS. Thanks so much for joining us, being a part of the program. 303-696-1971 is our telephone number if you'd like to join in to the festivities. You can also text into the show on the 710 KNUS app on your smartphone. A lot of moving parts going on right now as the war continues between Israel and Hamas. We will get expert insights in the 7 o'clock hour from retired Brigadier General Doug Slocum, and I'm looking forward to getting his perspective. Should be some powerful insights you will not want to miss. In addition, we will be joined at the bottom of this hour by Michael Barone. He is the senior political analyst at the Washington Examiner and a longtime guru of politics. I call him the one-man political almanac. He did co-author the American Political Almanac, and we will talk with him about, among other things, the debacle in D.C., where there is still a leadership struggle going on. Yesterday, we spent a lot of time talking about this issue of Jim Jordan running to be Speaker of the House. Would he become the guy that Republicans put into that position? When we got off the air, shortly after, it was said that Jordan had accepted the idea of and was wanting to move forward with the idea of having Speaker Pro Tem Patrick McHenry be the interim speaker for the time being. And then there was a lot of pushback from conservatives. Now, Jim Jordan at this moment is addressing the media on an upcoming speaker vote. I believe that is scheduled today. Billy, can we dip into that for just a moment?
We're just going to call roll call vote after roll call vote today and tomorrow and into the weekend and try to wear your opponents down, because it didn't seem like you made any progress yesterday.
It's a question from Chad Pergram, Fox News.
Lose 10 to 15 votes. We stayed the same. We picked up a few. We lost a few. I think the ones we lost can come back. So, look, there's been multiple rounds of votes for speaker before. We all know that. I just know that we need to get a speaker as soon as possible so we can get to work for the American people.
Thank you, Congressman. So just to be clear, we plan to ride this out this weekend if we don't get the votes today. And then secondly, President Biden has...
Another question asking about riding this out through the weekend. And that's a big question. Will they ride it out?
You're making the case for why we need to get the House open so we can evaluate the package. We can't do that. Can't vote on that. Can't pass anything in that until we get the House open. So I got to see the package, but we certainly need to help Israel. But I got to see the package. But again, we can't do that. The House isn't open. All the more reason why we need to get the House open as soon as possible.
Mr. Jordan,
So
what do you say to the people?
we're just jumping in, but it sounds like he's digging his heels in and wants to keep going and going and going. That we need to get Speaker quickly.
I got 200 votes, the speaker designee from my colleagues. The sooner we can get this accomplished, the better for the American people who expect us to work for them and for our friends and allies like the great state of Israel.
Again, Jim Jordan is live doing a press conference at D.C.
We had a good conversation. We'll continue to do that. But as I point out, the fastest way to get to work for the American people is to elect a speaker so the House can be open and we can get things done. I'll take a couple more.
Asking about Ken Buck.
Just that. Just. I think there were all kinds of problems with the 2020 election. I've been clear about that. My intention in forwarding the email was an argument made by former Inspector General for Donald Rumsfeld, accomplished lawyer who laid out an argument from the Federalist Papers. I forwarded it on to them. That was all it was.
We could dip out from Jim Jordan. I think that's a good place to wrap up our hearing of what's going on in his press conference, because it was a question about Ken Buck, and Ken Buck has concerns about the email that Jim Jordan sent to Mark Meadows regarding Mike Pence, and was forwarding the email of a legal perspective, and also was asked about the what was that? The second part of the question, just in general, his view on January 6th, I think, and the elections, and there was a non-answer there, which is something that you'd expect. He doesn't want to address it. It was more dodging it. He just said, "Oh, I forwarded an email," and that was all that it was. I don't know how things proceed here vis-a-vis the number of times they decide to go through and vote. It seems like they are digging their heels in, and Jordan is now committing, in essence, to let me go ahead and keep having these votes nonstop because we need to get a speaker ASAP, put somebody in there. That's going to be me, and we're going to keep at it. And that clearly is just, I think that there's a presumption there that he can do it, that he can eventually sew this thing up, and let's just have all the votes that McCarthy did. And I don't know how well that works. And they asked a question about Ken Buck, who has concerns over what happened on the House floor on January 6th when it comes to of 2021, when it comes to Jim Jordan. And there are other issues. I mean, that's the one media wants to focus on for sure, but there are plenty of other issues and many other Republicans who are opposed to Jim Jordan. And the idea that they're going to keep going nonstop with votes, I just don't see it. Weekend plan is to elect a speaker. Maybe he'll do it. Maybe he'll pull that out. But right now, we are in the middle of a war between Israel and Gaza. You've got the war that's ongoing in Ukraine. You've got a fiscal cliff situation where you need to get these budgets passed and move ahead and, frankly, avoid a government shutdown that Republicans will get blamed for if it happens. So you do need to get this sorted out quickly. He's right about that. The weekend plan is to elect a speaker. Okay, but is that going to be successful? Will it be him? Will he be willing to back down at some point if it's clear that he cannot secure the votes? And maybe there's another path where you can find a consensus speaker of the House. And maybe that is Patrick McHenry, maybe that isn't. I understand that Democrats might need to be on board with a pathway to, at least supposedly, would need to be on board with a pathway for Speaker McHenry or Speaker Pro Temp McHenry to temporarily serve as an interim speaker. I don't think that's the case if Republicans would just get their act together and agree, hey, let's go ahead and make this a thing for the rest of the year. Now, it's precedent setting and it's historic. It's not ideal, but I still think that it could be the best way forward if the effort is simply to focus on Jim Jordan and drilling that one home and not having any wiggle room for somebody else. I don't see how this advantages Republicans politically either. And there's a perception here of GOP House dysfunction, that they can't get it together even to select a leader, a Speaker of the House. So then how are they going to govern? I think that is a legitimate concern. Agree, disagree. 303-696-1971 is our telephone number. I think it is a legitimate concern for the American people to look at the Republican House right now and say, you guys can't even get a leader. And here's the bigger problem. Set aside the politics of it. If you can't select a Speaker of the House, how can you get work done in Congress? That is to say, being Speaker of the House is a job that's like herding cats. How are you, if you're a weak speaker who barely squeaks by or forces your way through or what have you, how are you going to be able to lead the Republicans moving forward in a real world way, not just in the sense of the politics and how people look at it from the optics of it all? How can you actually lead? And what would prevent what happened to McCarthy 10 months into his speakership from happening to Jim Jordan? Especially if in the case of McCarthy, he had more support in that motion to vacate than Jim Jordan does in his bid to become speaker. Now, let me restate, of course, what I said yesterday about Jordan. I like him. I'm cool with him as speaker. I have a few questions about his ability to lead, even more so now after these delays and the inability to rally folks at a time of a real need to get things moving in the House. If he can do it, great. And I hope that the Republicans will be able to rally together and get things done. But at this point, I just don't see the strategy to it. And I'm concerned about the implications of going forward with additional votes, specifically if it's tailored toward Jim Jordan as the only guy. Now, if there's an openness to other people and they can find a consensus person over the course of this weekend, then maybe, just maybe, it'll be worth it. But I don't know. It's irritating, frustrating to see the Republican-controlled House of Representatives that could be taking action on the budgets, that could be taking action on supporting Israel, and to see them instead bogged down in weeks of debate and dissension over leadership. I just don't know where you go from here. I mean, the next year is probably not going to be much better for Republicans if they can't even heal wounds enough to find some sort of a consensus leader. I hope that they'll do that this weekend and that they'll find somebody, whether that ends up being Jim Jordan or somebody else, but that it has the potential, whatever they decide, to move ahead. To move ahead. We'll see what happens. 303-696-1971. You can text into the show on the 710K and US app on your smartphone, and we'll talk in a bit with Michael Barone. The other big news that we will be covering, of course, President Joe Biden gave his speech last night on Israel, but not just Israel, also Ukraine, where he made a moral case for supporting both Israel and Ukraine, but he also did some other things that were rather curious to me. There's also the controversy of whether or not it was wise for him or the right thing for him to bridge together Israel and Ukraine in a speech. Now, I think from a tactical standpoint, or maybe it's strategic is the better word in this case, I think it was probably a smart move to work Ukraine into it. I think he spoke a little too much about Ukraine, but we haven't heard the president really address why the American people have been supporting our Ukrainian allies in their war against an aggressive Russia. We haven't seen Biden bring that about in a public context and really make that case until last night. And I think when you have an opportunity, the eyes are on you over Israel, work that in a bit so you can say, okay, we've got two wars that we are not ourselves directly involved in as far as sending troops and having military forces on the ground, that kind of thing, in Israel and in Ukraine. So here's why we are involved in both of those conflicts. But focus on Israel. We've got a lot of clips that we'll break down today on the program from Biden's speech last night. I do think he underemphasized Israel and that he diluted the crisis that we have in this country that we spoke a great deal about yesterday with Rabbi Jonathan Hausman about anti-Semitism and the skyrocketing, the surge of anti-Semitism in American society right now, in our world. It is astonishing to me to see the amount of anti-Semitic incidents that we are seeing now, and Biden goes in there and mixes in discussions of Islamophobia. I don't think this was the time to do that. Work in Ukraine a little bit, fine. But focus on anti-Semitism and strongly condemning anti-Semitism unequivocally, and focus on that in this moment where we are seeing it dramatically increase, especially on college campuses. We have seen posters being put up for kidnapped women and children from Israel. And those posters are being taken down on American college campuses by those with sympathies for Hamas. Unacceptable. And that needs to be resoundingly condemned and not watered down with other things being thrown into the mix. But we've got a lot to say about that. We've got a lot to hear from you about that coming up, and to hear from Biden with his clips we've got from the speech. Again, 303-696-1971 is our telephone number. You can text into the show on the 710 KNUS app on your smartphone. Name in town if you wish to text in. In addition, email me 24/7, 365. You can go to the 710 KNUS website and log on to my show's page. That's the Jimmy Sengenberger Show. Of course, running every Saturday morning from 6 until 9. Or you can log on to my website, jimmysengenberger.com. Keep in mind, there's no A, I, or U in Sengenberger. It's all E's all the time. Once you know that, Sengenberger is easy. Now, one quick programming note for you as we get things rolling. We'll be back with Michael Barone here in a moment. News Talk 710 KNUS is pleased to welcome Brandon Tatum to the 710 lineup. Brandon is a nationally syndicated radio host and former Tucson, Arizona police officer who's been featured on Fox News and Newsmax and has a huge social media presence. Join us for the Officer Tatum Show, weekday afternoons from 4 to 7, starting Monday, November 6th, only on News Talk 710 KNUS. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, filling in for George Brockler right here on Denver's local talk leader, News Talk 710 KNUS.
Want to take your favorite radio station wherever you go? Well, now there's an app for that. No matter where you are, stream your favorite shows. Tap the app to listen to podcasts. Talk back to your favorite local hosts.
At the tone, leave a message.
Call the show. Set your alarm. Enter contests and win prizes. All in the palm of your hand. Available now for iOS and Android devices in the App Store or Google Play. And best of all, it's free. Download today.
Say goodbye to clutter and hello to convenience when you experience organization transformation in your home. Roll 'em Out Shelves, your clutter transformation experts, create affordable Colorado-crafted organized storage solutions. These custom options will maximize and organize your kitchen and bath storage as Roll 'em Out Shelves carefully designs and builds roll-out drawers to fit your space perfectly. To clear the clutter, contact owners Joyce and Brent at Roll 'em Out Shelves to schedule your free in-home estimate today.
Jimmy Sengenberger here with you in for George Brockler today. Talk 710 KNUS 303-696-1971 is our telephone number when we have opportunities to call in. But the best way for the moment to join into the conversation is via the 710 KNUS app on your smartphone. Good to be with you this morning, as always. And it is quite a time politically. I can't recall anything like this as far as disorganization, which is maybe a nice way of putting it, in the House like this, where they can't sort through, the political party that's in charge of the House of Representatives can't sort through their leadership issues to find somebody. We just heard a little bit of Congressman Jim Jordan, who's vying to be Speaker of the House, his press conference, where he indicated they're going to go through the weekend with consistent votes after having failed twice on Tuesday and Wednesday. Staggering to think about where we are and the amount of issues that are on the plate for Congress, and yet the Republicans can't move ahead. Let's talk about this and much more with America's one-man political almanac, co-author of the American Political Almanac, in fact, and a new book that is coming out in November, which we will tease here in a bit, called Mental Maps of the Founders. He is the senior political analyst at the Washington Examiner. His name is Michael Barone, and he rejoins me here on 710 KNUS. Michael, welcome back. It's good to talk with you, my friend.
Well, it's good to be with you, Jimmy. It seems that the altitude has not negatively affected your judgment very much. And you're continuing to suffer, to prosper physically from the vigor required to navigate at 5,000 feet above sea level.
Yeah, I know. Oh, don't I know it? And especially when I go and I play some harmonica, which I do at this elevation, it certainly adds a little bit into the challenge at this elevation. But I do love it, and things are pretty decent here in the Mile High City. So, Michael, is disorganization too nice of a word, or disorganized too nice of a word for the Republican caucus right now in the House? Have you ever seen anything like this historically?
Well, the answer is I think I have seen something historically like this when I was covering the 1850s. But,
that was a tense time for you, right? Big deal.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The parties sometimes form circular firing squads. The House Republicans seem to have a dodecahedron right now. And I think what's really happened is that we're watching a political norm disappearing, being violated over and over again. The norm was that when you voted in your conference, that's the Republican term, or in your caucus, the Democratic term, you supported one candidate or another for speaker. Your candidate may have lost. When you came out of it, you voted for the candidate for speaker that the majority had supported. You just didn't dissent. Now, we saw some erosion of that in the late 1990s, when some members declined to vote, said they wouldn't vote for Newt Gingrich again. That forced him out after the Republican Party suffered minor losses in 1998 rather than the expected gains. We've seen it eroded to some extent with Democrats, sometimes in significant numbers, but not decisive numbers, voted against Nancy Pelosi. They could go back to their district and say, hey, I'm a moderate. I didn't vote for Nancy Pelosi, whatever. But now we've seen, with successive members of the House, we've seen 8 members vote essentially to depose Kevin McCarthy. We've seen Steve Scalise refuse even to come to the floor because he had many Republicans not ready to vote for him. And we've seen with Jim Jordan, the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, voting against him, one of the grandees of the House of Representatives, not just somebody from the right-wing fringe of the party, or somebody representing a Democratic-leaning district. about one of the powers of the party. So she felt free to cast her vote against Jordan, and now he seems bent on showing over and over again that he's capable of losing support from vote to voter, which is at least what's happened so far. We'll see if that continues. It's a pretty kind of a suicidal thing for a party. It seems like the Republican Party, or significant parts of it, doesn't have a real desire to participate in the making of public policy. The position they're in politically means that they don't have it, but that they're just not interested they're interested in flailing out in all directions. One result may be if we end up going to Patrick McHenry, the sort of designated fill-in speaker under the 2003 law and by Kevin McCarthy's designation. If he continues, we may be moving more towards what you'll see in the British House of Commons, and I think in the House of, the lower legislative body in other British Commonwealth countries, where the speaker isn't a partisan figure. The speaker in Britain is neutral. The speaker in Britain gets reelected without major party opposition. Often, you have a conservative party choosing a Labour member as the speaker because they think that individual will be fair and loyal to institutional norms. That was tested when the speaker took a partisan role against Brexit, but he was eventually eased out under amount of term limits. So maybe we're going in that direction, but it's something different. As I say, the 1850s, you had multiple ballots. You had the death of the Whig Party, the rise and fall of the American or Know-Nothing Party, huge splits in the Democratic Party, and the emergence of the Republican Party leading to a civil war. We're not quite in that dire straits, whatever happens to Jim Jordan's bid.
So let's break down a few of the things that you were just discussing. Michael Barone, senior political analyst at the Washington Examiner. I'm looking at one aspect of this, which is the notion of in the past, with the exception of, say, 1850, but in the modern era, we have mostly had these discussions about a speaker sewed up in the back room. Then they come out and they have the vote and they're ready to move ahead. Certainly, Nancy Pelosi would have never brought forward any speakership vote unless she had the votes. If she had any doubt, she wouldn't have done it. She would have sorted that out, right? And you look back in the 1990s with Newt Gingrich, and they had their vote. It was clear behind closed doors. He didn't have the support anymore, so he bowed out, and they moved ahead with a new speaker direction. Wasn't that Hastert? But when we look at that dynamic, how do you see the Republicans today sort of breaking that traditional norm? And then in a moment, maybe we'll talk about the political implications of that too.
Well, it just kind of fascinates me. It just shows that one of the things is they haven't had leadership that's been able to instill a sense of common purpose, for whatever that says. The Democratic Party under Pelosi has been their party leader from 2003 until she bowed out at age 82 after the 2022 election. The Democratic Party has had more cohesion and certainly has it now. I think some of it came out in the period when Ted Cruz over in the Senate in 2013, newly elected, was telling House Republicans, if you just don't vote for a budget, we can force them to, we defund Obamacare, we can force them to get rid of Obamacare. Well, that wasn't going to work with the Democrats then a majority in the Senate and with the president having a veto. But he got people encouraged to, thinking they were on the outs and so forth. This has been exacerbated, obviously, in the Trump years by the emergence of significant policy differences among some of the Republicans. But there just seems to be a lack of fellow feeling here, which is not something I would have predicted starting in 2010, 2011,
Yeah.
2012, but here we are.
Well, Michael, one of the things that is striking is, look, I mean, you had McCarthy ousted by 8 Republicans, and now Jim Jordan has the support of fewer Republicans than McCarthy did at the time. When we look at that aspect of this, I think that's notable. And especially given as you have now a pledge from Jordan, we're going to keep going into the weekend. Yesterday, that McHenry idea of let's put him in as the interim speaker was originally something that he floated, Jim Jordan floated. Some conservative supporters of his got upset about it, thought that it was a terrible idea. In fact, here's an example of that. Matt Gaetz, the congressman who brought the resolution, the motion to vacate the speaker with McCarthy, here's what he said yesterday.
I'm against Speaker Light. I'm against Bud Light. I believe it is a constitutional desecration to not elect a Speaker of the House. We need to stay here until we elect a Speaker. And if someone can't get the votes, we need to go on to the next person. But twisting and torturing the Constitution to empower a temporary speaker is having a Speaker Light that is not constitutionally contemplated, is deeply infirm, and I will do everything possible to stop it.
Of course, this is the same guy who's the key reason that we don't have a Speaker of the House currently anyway. But Michael, what do you make of that, especially historically? You were just talking about the idea, you could have maybe a nonpartisan figure or somebody who's less partisan, who's more shepherding the process in the House as opposed to the inner workings of can we get legislation through, for example, more like the president of the Senate, in a sense, is what I took away from that, where in the Senate you have the majority leader drive the legislation forward. And if the president of the Senate is called in, that's just more, in that case, it's more ceremonial, or it's to break a tie-breaking vote. This would be a little bit more because it's day to day, but it wouldn't be a policy-making position in the same way that it has been. I don't think Gaetz is right constitutionally, that there's some constitutional requirement for the Speaker of the House to do these things that he's saying are necessary.
Well, I don't think, if Matt Gaetz is your authority on the Constitution,
it is not.
You've been pretty desperate search of an authority on the Constitution.
A very fair point.
I'd advance the name of William Pennington. William Pennington, after multiple ballots, was elected Speaker of the House following what we would call the 1858 round of elections. They actually held them around the calendar. And he was a Whig. The Whig Party was basically in the process of disappearing and pretty much had disappeared, but it hadn't disappeared from William Pennington's district in New Jersey. So he was elected Speaker of the House. The House did not do very much legislation, and in fact, in the period of which it was serving up to March 4th, 1861, it saw the dissolution of the Union. That's not a really happy precedent for somebody who is not capable of delivering a majority. But that's the sort of situation where we're at, where basically any number of Republicans from different wings and positions of political seniority in the party feel morally free to withhold their votes from the Speaker and continue this situation. So, they're making the sort of arguments that used to be made behind the scene in the upshot toward the secret votes that were taken at both the Democratic caucus, at the Republican conference. And there would be, whisperings of this would come into the papers and reportage sometime. Jim Jordan is sort of mean and nasty to other people. Steve Scalise is a little bit of a squish on this issue or that issue. Arguments like that would be made at people. Those were arguments that were generally considered irrelevant.
Yeah.
After the caucus had decided. I mean, in November, December 1976, the Democrats had 291 members, and they had a vote for majority leader. There was no opposition to Tip O'Neill becoming the speaker, the new speaker. Carl Albert, the previous speaker, had retired from Congress, and it was a one vote margin. Jim Wright beat Phil Burton by one vote. It never crossed Phil Burton's mind that he would go to the floor.
This really.
Speaker position is a little different from majority leader.
Yeah, this is fundamentally a shift in how things are done, and I think it's to the detriment of Republicans to not be able to sew this up behind closed doors. And I don't mean that behind closed doors in a negative way. That's what you need to do. This isn't the kind of issue that you have and hash out publicly. Unfortunately, the computer will be cutting me off very shortly, so we have to leave it there. I want to wish you the best of luck, though, on your forthcoming book, Mental Maps of the Founders, being published by Encounter Books, a series of 6 essays on the geographical orientation of 6 of the founders. It sounds utterly fascinating and has the esteemed endorsement of Gordon Wood, as you let me know, one of the great historians of colonial and early Republican America. Fascinating read, I'm sure. Looking forward to it. Michael Barone, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks for letting me be with you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Always appreciate it as well. Once again, Michael Barone, senior political analyst at the Washington Examiner, joining us. Jimmy Sengenberger in for George Brockler. Overdue for a break here on News Talk 710 KNUS. Living that Rocky Mountain way, Jimmy Sengenberger back with you in for George Brockler. News Talk 710 KNUS. Always appreciate the analysis and insights from Michael Barone. Didn't have as much time as I would have liked with him. He always has a lot to say, and he's one of those guests that's so brilliant and has so much knowledge that you're like, I want to jump in, but I don't want to jump in, so I'm going to wait and let him continue his point. But of course, he's got a lot to say, so that it limits the questions that you can get in. But the fundamental key point that we took away from Michael is that the last time you had, until Kevin McCarthy in January of this year, of course, that you had multiple votes for speaker in this kind of a situation was just before the Civil War in the 1850s. Let that sink in for a moment. The last time a political party couldn't get it together was in the 1850s. In 1998, Newt Gingrich gets ready to continue his speakership, and he finds out, guess what? I don't have the support. I can't move forward. We got to do something different. And I believe it was Denny Hastert that replaced him. And I look at this and I think, okay, that's significant because guess what? When you can't get it done, in this case, behind closed doors, this is a reasonable thing to sort out behind closed doors and then come out in public and have your vote and move on. When you can't get it together like that, what does it show the American people? That you can't govern, that you're dysfunctional. Oh, we can rationalize it all we want and say this is about principle and we want to have the right policy approach. And so why not stop it midstream and reset the ship and so forth with a new speaker and power through? And we're going to get Jim Jordan. By golly, he's going to be the guy, or whoever it is. 10 months in to the Congress with wars afoot, allies in need, and a budgetary situation where if we have we might have a government shutdown, which normally I'm not concerned about, but this is the wrong reason for a government shutdown because Republicans can't, as leaders of the House, get it together. The perception of dysfunction is the undoing of a political party, at the very least in the short term, and the undoing of an institution in the short run. Look at the dysfunction of the Denver School Board and the perception there, which is an accurate one, and how that has derailed how Denverites view Denver public schools. The same kind of thing applies here with the Republican Party. This is a historic problem. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger in for George Brockler. When we come back, retired General, Brigadier General Doug Slocum will offer insights on the war in Gaza. Stay with us. Now for the second hour of the George Show, Jimmy Sengenberger filling in for George Brockler for day number 2. And of course, back in the saddle tomorrow morning from 6 until 9 with the Jimmy Sengenberger Show right here on Denver's local talk leader, News Talk 710 KNUS. So great to be with you as we shift gears from the politics of a dysfunctional U.S. House of Representatives into the war in Israel and Gaza. This would be, of course, the consequence of Hamas launching an unprovoked, brutal attack, terrorist attack on innocent civilians in Israel. I mean, I still am just marked by coming on the air for my show on Saturday, October 7th. And our boss here at the station, Kelly Michaels, was covering the board for me that day, producing the show. And he said, "Have you seen the news about Israel?" And I said, "No, I hadn't yet." And I went online and boom, it's what we talked about a good chunk of the show. And I will never forget when I learned about the music festival. And as a musician who plays harmonica, who loves going to concerts, to see that 260 people who were at a music festival for peace get slaughtered and many more kidnapped and taken hostage by Hamas, let alone what's happened to the women and children who have fallen victim to Hamas's terrorism. I mean, it is all abominable. And Joe Biden, President of the United States, last night addressed these issues of the war in Israel as well as the war in Ukraine. And here's just a little bit how he closed that speech last night.
We cannot and will not let terrorists like Hamas and tyrants like Putin win. I refuse to let that happen. In moments like these, we have to remember who we are. We are the United States of America. The United States of America. And there is nothing beyond our capacity if we do it together.
Now, what is happening on the ground in Israel and Gaza? What is the situation like from a military standpoint? I'm really pleased to be able to get expert insights from a retired Brigadier General of the United States Air Force. For 35 years, he served in the Air Force. He's a career fighter pilot. Last 5 years of his time serving our country was commanding the 127th Wing of the Air National Guard, along with commanding the Selfridge Air Base in Michigan. And he is, which is home to 4,500 active Guard and Reserve military and civilian personnel. He has extensive experience. And just to be clear, it was the Selfridge Air National Guard base in Michigan. And Brigadier General retired Doug Slocum joins me now. General, welcome to the program. Really appreciate you taking some time today.
Well, Jimmy, thanks. I appreciate the time to talk and look forward to looking at some of the issues that are going on there in the Middle East right now.
Yeah, it is a complicated and tenuous situation, to be sure, not to mention the barbarism. I'll just start with the broad question. How are you looking at this war right now as we get just about 2 weeks into it?
Well, as you can imagine, it's a very complicated situation. You did a great job there of describing, what happened, this surprise attack that came from Hamas from Gaza into Israel itself, clearly catching Israel off guard. Their response at this point has been primarily, as what we can see, is at arm's length, using artillery, using air power, using ways to reach in and to be able to attack the infrastructure in Gaza. I think Israel, once they had this reflective reaction of wanting to do something immediately, strategically realizing that what's going on in Gaza is a little bit of a Kobayashi Maru, hearkening that Star Trek simulator, Captain Kirk, I can't solve this problem conundrum.
Yes.
That they're looking at an area that's 30 miles long by about 6 to 7 miles wide on average, with 2 million people who can't get out. Now you have the civilian population, you have hundreds of hostages, and you have a very capable military, but How do you, rescue hostages? How do you target just Hamas within this large morass of humanity that's out there in Gaza? And I think they're realizing that they have to take their time. Just like we did in the first Gulf War, there's this long period of, let's say, call it sculpting the battlefield the way that you want, with infrastructure, with, psychology, to go from phase one, which is this kind of keeping things at arm's length, to phase two, where it's going to be up close and personal. If, the Israeli IDF goes into Gaza itself, is going to be a whole new realm of this conflict. And they realize that's going to be very, very difficult in ways we can talk about.
One of those ways is, of course, the tunneling system that they use in Gaza. The Hamas, this is one of the ways that they get into Israel. This is one of the ways that they transport people as well as their items and weapons and so forth. How does that complicate things? That you just mentioned a little bit about the growing emphasis on what do you do next in terms of whether you do a ground invasion or what have you. How does that fit in this tunneling system from your standpoint?
Well, in the military, we have this tendency, we always talk about preparing to fight the last war. What we found when Hamas attacked was they were very ingenious in employing tactics, techniques, weapons, and all that were not expected. Kind of like, going back to the 1973 war and the Suez and the Barev line and the fortresses and all, which is kind of a thin eyes and ears sort of a barrier on the Suez that Egypt very ingeniously was able to circumvent and surprise Israel. Well, in the same case here, a very automated, low-manned type of a system along the border there, they were able to plan, execute, and use tactics and all that completely caught Israel by surprise. They were able to breach these defenses, blind their eyes in a way that allowed them to be, from their perspective, very effective at crossing the border and causing the damage in Israel that they did. You call it the complete lack of humanity. What we have to realize too, that Hamas is not militarily on par with Israel by any stretch of the imagination. You want to put anything on paper, Israel would just simply wipe them off the map. But we're dealing with it. There's always a complicated situation. And here, I guess, probably the term lawfare would probably be most appropriate, which is this is a PR battle in a lot of ways. And we're seeing this played out, for example, with what's going on with that hospital strike, who really did it, trying to affect opinion, perspectives, and to turn your adversary into the enemy, not through weapons, but with information.
It's so profound that you would raise this point, Brigadier General retired Doug Slocum. We're talking about the PR battle, and let's look more at the hospital, as you mentioned. Just a few days ago, this blast happened at a hospital that the Palestinians say killed more than 500 innocent people. And in the beginning, there were all these reports, this was an Israeli airstrike. But what we then learned is that it apparently was Islamic Jihad, another jihadist terrorist group affiliated with Iran that had launched a series of rockets into Israel, and one of them misfired and ended up hitting the hospital. And Israel was waiting until they could get a little bit more details to say confidently, this is what happened. They did. They put it out there, tried to clear up that misinformation. Then the U.S. government bolsters that. In fact, we heard mention from President Biden last night in his speech saying it was not Israel that did that strike. And yet we continue to see all of these claims, including from Americans, even members of Congress, saying otherwise and casting doubt on the facts as we now know them. How significant is it when you have an incident as tragic as a hospital blast like that, killing people, and then the word gets out, this was Israel, and the train is going and you can't just stop it?
Well, you're exactly right, because it was, once the strike happened, once they got the word out, the cork was out of the bottle from the information perspective. You can show all the facts you want, but people are going to they're going to listen to the information source that they want to, that they're favorable to. It's kind of human nature. It's just like here in the United States, which news broadcast do you listen to is going to, based on your perspectives of things, it's who you're going to favor. They showed the facts as presented there. The president, I was very surprised, came out with a pretty strong statement in support that, indeed, the U.S. intel services showed that it was not, Israel that caused this particular incident. But at the same time, that didn't sway a lot of the folks who are already out protesting, getting on the news, talking their talking points here. And I think we're going to see more of that as this progresses, especially if there's the ground invasion that happens in Gaza itself. We're going to hear the stories about the mosques and the children, and all those types of things are going to proliferate and dominate. So in a lot of ways, this battle is going to be a battle for opinion, for the airwaves or I guess it would be the internet nowadays, of what's really going on. And as we've seen, there's pictures of talking about the hospital strike, and it's accompanied by pictures of things that aren't even there, pictures that have nothing to do with that particular site. So if you wanted to call it misinformation, it's rampant, and there's not really a way to correct that nowadays. And you end up with people pointing a lot of fingers, yelling at each other, and the situation spirals out of control like kind of a self-licking ice cream cone, if you will, pretty quickly.
The Israeli Defense Forces are formidable. They, of course, are bolstered by the Iron Dome system that Israel has. But in terms of their capacity to fight Hamas, that's and this kind of war, and you were touching on that a little bit ago as well. How do you assess, especially having worked with the IDF in the past, how they're approaching this so far and what their capabilities are in this kind of a war where especially you are talking about a lot of innocent civilians who are among the terrorists in Gaza, where you have the use of places like hospitals, quite frankly, as cover, as human shields for the terrorists. And then you have to figure out, okay, how do we launch these strikes, minimize the casualties of civilians and so forth? From your experience with the IDF, assess their capacity, how they approach things and so forth.
Well, yes, the IDF is a very unique structure in the fact that their standing army is just a small portion of the IDF. They're full-time. The defense of Israel is based on their very large and capable reserve system. So you have people that are all involved in the economy all across the country, who served in the military or have military training, who when called then can pick up weapons, report to the military bases then and be mobilized to defend the country. So what we saw when this happened is that, the small standing army, one, clearly got caught flat-footed in this case. The second was that they had been infiltrated. And number one was to try and prevent loss of life, any further loss of life, and basically make sure that Israel itself was secure. So a large portion of what we've been seeing is, let's call it a recovery effort, licking the wounds to try and, one, confine Hamas back to Gaza as they mobilize. So they go from tens of thousands of troops to hundreds of thousands, over 300,000 at this point that have been mobilized. So it takes a while to, if you will, spin up that capability. The more advanced notice they would have had, the more they would have been able to do that. But clearly it's been that mobilization. Then the other aspect, of course, is information. You can't just strike back without knowing what you're striking at. So what is the status of the intelligence services? You can only see so much from the air, which is clearly dominated by Israel. But as you mentioned, the tunnels. How do you find out where the tunnels are within Gaza? Israel learned pretty quickly that the tunnels into their country were a danger, and they built some pretty effective barriers and systems to be able to detect that. But once you get within Gaza itself, it becomes this networked underground capability. And of course, Hamas has gotten surprisingly sophisticated weapons, both in terms of quantity as well as quality. We've been reading in the news how North Korean weapons have been found pretty prolific in being used by Hamas to include surface-to-air weapons, anti-tank, certain types of mines, etc. So the question is, from what Israel knows about, what is it that they don't know about, and what kind of surprises are going to be there going forward?
Yeah, for a moment, let's talk, if we could, Brigadier General Slocum, about the IDF being caught flat-footed, Israeli intelligence failures here, because it raises questions not only about how did this happen, which the Israeli government has basically said, we're going to address that after. Right now, we're focused on fighting this war. But it also implicates that question of how much don't they know about Hamas and what they're set up to do at this point, and their capacity, and of course the positions maybe of their resources. How do you examine that aspect of this, given the significant intelligence failure that we haven't seen, by my understanding, for Israel since 1973?
Well, you're exactly right. And I think that's what Israel's trying to do now, is to paint that picture, to have an accurate understanding of what it is they're facing from their adversary in Gaza. They clearly didn't have a complete and a whole picture, even if they knew the orders of battle, the types of equipment and supplies and everything that had been flowing in prior. The planning for and the execution of this raid, clearly they were not prepared for it at all, or very, very minor, other than their day-to-day type of things. So there will be a reckoning of that, and there was, just like you said, in 1973. But I think all of Israel realizes that at the time of crisis is not the time to address that. Right now, it's the call to arms in Israel, the declaration of war, the solving the problem of Hamas, and eventually probably Hezbollah and others that have been this growing threat that have now stepped over that red line for the IDF. So they're mobilizing the country. They have a lot of resources available, but once again, you've got a very sticky situation that even if you have the best capabilities there are, how do you employ these in this particular scenario, this situation? Because as soon as Israel, strikes back in any similar type of a way, targeting civilians, it'll be all over the news, and we go back to that concept of lawfare and the battle for the news.
Brigadier General retired Doug Slocum joining us this morning. Jimmy Sengenberger in for George Brockler. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back on the other side, let's talk a bit more about the missile and rocket battle that we are seeing in not just Israel, Gaza, but Hezbollah, and of course now with the situation broadening, Yemen and so forth being brought into the fold here with more dynamism in the situation, and not the good kind of dynamism. We're going to take a break. We'll be back with much more as we continue an insightful conversation here on Denver's local talk leader, News Talk 710 KNUS. Coming up here, bottom of the 7 o'clock hour, Jimmy Sengenberger in for George Boxer this morning here on Denver's local talk leader, News Talk 710 KNUS. We are talking with retired Brigadier General of the U.S. Air Force, 35-year veteran Doug Slocum. His call sign was Odie when he was a career fighter pilot, and the last 5 years served as the commander of the 127th Wing of the Air National Guard. And General, I want to pick up on our conversation, particularly looking for a moment at the biggest piece that we have seen in this war between Israel and Hamas, which is the use of rockets and missiles. And we're seeing this more in the region writ large, not just in the Gaza Strip area. But when it comes to the use of these missiles, one of the key components here, of course, is Israel has their Iron Dome system, which is proving very effective, although clearly not 100%, but it has made a big difference. Talk to us, if you would, a little bit about that dynamic of the use of rockets in this war.
Well, you bet. And it's nothing new. This started, decades ago. Iron Dome was designed based on this threat and a counter to it, but not sophisticated, relatively cheap, easy to manufacture. Rockets can be any degree of technology, from very basic, short range, unreliable, up to what we see now used by the military, which are very capable, guided, long range, etc. But what started out as, some simple rocket type of a threat, certainly has involved both in terms of quality and quantity. Because what we saw happen, a couple of weeks ago was literally thousands of rockets in that first 20-minute period. Iron Dome is a very capable system, the Tamir missiles that fire out of there, but there are only so many missiles that are ready in the batteries. I believe it's the 6 batteries of this system that Israel possesses. So once you intercept a couple thousand rockets, at some point you're out of missiles. So it becomes a quantity battle at this point. Hezbollah has understood that. That's why they've stockpiled so many. And I think that's exactly what we saw happen in the South, was simply that the supply of these very capable weapons, not just did they have them, but were they at the ready, quickly was exhausted by the sheer weight of the quantity of things being launched by out of Gaza. The other is that the rockets can be launched from these urban areas, from the churches, the mosques, the hospitals, these types of places that are very, very difficult to strike back. Capabilities nowadays, you can very quickly put weapons on a launch site. So the goal of Hamas is going to be to launch them from a place where it's precarious to be able to strike back, and then of course shoot and move, or shoot and hide. And that's what we're seeing. It's a tough problem to solve. It goes back to this geography that we're not talking about a whole lot of property here. When you're talking 30 miles by 5 to 6 miles wide, and rockets that now can pretty much reach anywhere in Israel from Gaza or from Lebanon. So it puts the whole country at risk. They are developing a follow-on to the Iron Dome that's actually going to be a directed energy laser type of a weapon. So think of it as a limitless magazine of capacity to shoot things down, but not operational yet that I'm aware of, but certainly technology in the future. So it becomes a tit for tat as we exchange technology for the answer to the threats.
How significant in this way, then, General Slocum, is it for the United States to continue to provide financial support to Israel, particularly for their Iron Dome and missile defense systems? Because, of course, this is something that can be a big issue for some in Congress who aren't as on board with this, who are skeptical, who won't even answer. We played a clip yesterday of Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, where she refused to answer whether she would support funding for Israel's Iron Dome. But how significant is that support from the United States for Israel, particularly given how big of a deal this missile defense system has been in this war?
Well, very specifically in this case, it's a missile that's designed and built in Israel. So it's nothing, we can fund it, but there's still the problem of that supply and production. We have purchased some Iron Dome systems to check them out and assess them in the United States. I would be surprised if we haven't offered very quickly to return those batteries that we've purchased, as well as any inventory of the missiles, back to Israel. And that's just something that could be done most likely without even congressional oversight in that case. But there are things, just like Israel learned in 1973, is the stockpiles of weapons. They had vastly underestimated the expenditures when it comes to a large shooting war. And just like what we're seeing now going on in Gaza, one of the biggest demands is for artillery shells. Ukraine has shown us that they can go through copious amounts, and we've been scouring pretty much the whole Western military capabilities stockpiles of that weapon, the shells for those artillery systems. And well, guess what? That's exactly now what's being demanded in Israel. Precision guided weapons of all sorts are also, there's nothing we drop nowadays. We in the United States, 100% of what we drop off our airplanes or shoot is going to be guided precision. And we build things now that are smaller with smaller warheads to have a smaller footprint. Because you think in Gaza, 500, 2,000 pound weapons make a really big crater. And that's a tough thing to do in a populated area without having, collateral type of damage or casualties as a result. So the demand for those precise, high-tech, high-cost type of weapons certainly would be part of any supply that we would be looking to give to Israel.
In terms of the desire to avoid civilian casualties, of course, Hamas would like the world to think that Israel will indiscriminately kill civilians like they do. We saw that with the aftermath of the blast at the hospital, of course, where there was this idea that folks were thinking, oh, well, of course, Israel would do this because they're willing to kill innocent civilians. But of course, Israel goes through great lengths to avoid civilian casualties to the greatest extent possible. And greatest extent possible, of course, is the operative term, because we are talking about a terrorist organization that uses innocents, including children, as human shields. Can you talk to us a little bit about, from your understanding, what Israel tries to do and how they can even avoid civilian casualties with these kinds of dynamics that are in play on the ground?
Well, and they've been, through the years have actually gotten very good, because, this goes back to that lawfare thing and the war for the airways. And there's phones everywhere and cameras that are going to take pictures and document things. Israel talks about, the phone calls to a house where they would basically say, hey, you get so much time to get out. They would give them a warning before striking to try and get to the civilians to evacuate. And I think that was the genesis of that evacuation order that they gave for northern Gaza, basically tell everybody to move south. They clearly see that the infrastructure and the problems in northern Gaza are the biggest threat. So they're trying to evacuate and get most of the civilians out of the way to minimize civilian casualties. But like I said, there's also using now the smaller, more precise weapons. The U.S. has figured this out even in our campaigns everywhere. We've designed weapons with very, very small warheads, all the way to missiles now that don't even have warheads. And we can be precise enough to say there's two people in a vehicle, hit the one in the right seat, not the one in the left. That degree of precision because of perception of civilian casualties and, trying to not be that person around the world, in our case, the United States. Here, it's Israel and Gaza. They don't want those pictures that are out there. Now, no matter what they do, there's always going to be the fake pictures. You blow up a building, that happens to be a headquarters of Hamas, and somebody posts pictures from something else and claim that it's from there. So there's always going to be that perception battle that's going to be going on.
General Slocum, one of the big questions that has been going on in the last couple of weeks is why Hamas would do this when, as you pointed out, militarily they can't go toe-to-toe with Israel, but of course they use these tactics that bring about the maximum amount of destruction and death that they can bring. When we look at Hamas's rationale for this and the timing, especially given that we know that this is backed by Iran, that this is driven by Iran, financed by Iran, how do you look at the motivations, especially for that timing? I mean, it happened the day after Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi government were talking about the potential for normalizing relations with Israel, building upon the Abraham Accords from the Trump administration, and talking about a possible defense pact between Saudi Arabia and the United States as a driving motivation for this. And of course, you had multiple Jewish holidays that were intersecting in that weekend of October 7th. How do you assess the motivation behind this, and why then?
Well, you bring up excellent points with all of that. My mind goes there's clearly some differences, but from a strategic standpoint, what you're bringing up makes me think of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. What was clearly a tactical disaster on the part of the Viet Cong. I mean, yes, they made strikes all across the country. It caught everybody by surprise. They ended up taking disproportional casualties and pretty much getting wiped out as a fighting organization in that war. Then that came, the North Vietnamese ended up taking over more directly instead of through the Viet Cong. And I bring that parallel up because Hamas, in this particular case, knows they can't, go toe-to-toe equally with the IDF. But in this case, they gave them the bloody nose. They have the shock value. So now the question is, what are going to be the strategic repercussions? I mean, there could be an argument. What's going to happen to the Netanyahu government as a result of this in the long run? So they're affecting a strategic equation through what they're doing, even if you wouldn't call it a tactical success. So the timing, a lot of that can be simply to catch people by surprise, to maximize the shock value. And I think that's why we saw the degree of brutality that we did, is they are exactly looking for that type of terror response and reaction out of Israel.
Well, and then in the Arab world, I mean, you put Saudi Arabia in a box, don't you, General? If you have this attack happen amidst the discussions of normalizing relations with Israel, which would be dramatic in the region. I mean, it's one thing for the United Arab Emirates, for example, to make a peace deal with Israel. It's another thing for Saudi Arabia to finally come out, even though they've been having back channel negotiations for years and clearly had to sign off as the, shall we say, the Sunni Arab big dog in the region when it comes to the other, compared to the other countries. They had to give a subtle, yes, it's okay for you to do this. So if you put Saudi Arabia in this position of, hey, look, do you really want to be on Israel's side right now? Then they're in a box that is more difficult to get out of, certainly in the short term. And so to me, that is one of the big things, in addition to the aspects that you were talking about.
And, yes, the ripples from this rock in the water, carry. Saudi Arabia was a big one because the initiatives going there to normalize the relationship. But you can just look in the surrounding region. Jordan, stuck between a rock and a hard place on how to react to Israel. Look what's happening in Turkey. We can go all around the world to include in our own country the impact of because of what's going on in Gaza. So, and now the question comes about broadening of the conflict. We could, talk about Hezbollah and Lebanon and what's going there, of course, which is the vicarious extension of Iran itself. And then we've seen the development in the last few days between the missiles that the USS Carney, a U.S. destroyer in the Red Sea, intercepted yesterday, or the rocket and drone attacks on our base in southern Syria, as well as al-Assad in Iraq. Now the U.S. is shooting weapons in the Middle East as part of this conflict. Right now, they've been defensive weapons, but how much is the U.S. going to be able to stand of our citizens being killed or our forces under attack as part of all this? So it's all tightening that noose a little bit. That's going to be driving people/countries' reactions.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned Iran, because that's worth discussing a little bit more and fleshing out the role of Iran, which is behind all of this. Here's a snippet of President Biden last night acknowledging that Iran is supporting Hamas. And of course, there are many other groups like you just talked about.
The risk of conflict and chaos could spread in other parts of the world, in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East, especially in the Middle East. Iran is supporting Russia in Ukraine, and it's supporting Hamas and other terrorist groups in the region. And we'll continue to hold them accountable, I might add.
I was glad to see Biden actually give some acknowledgement of Iran's role here, especially after having given $6 billion to Iran as part of those negotiations. But when we look at Iran, you see Hamas, you see Hezbollah, you see Yemen and the Houthis there. You see a variety of different areas where they are getting involved, and these are all proxies for Iran. What is the significance here, especially from an American policy perspective, of Iran meddling in these ways, and not just meddling, but actively saying, hey, we want our proxies to engage in these kinds of activities, including a war with Israel?
Well, and that's driving a lot of what we're seeing here. We could talk long on any of these different areas that you just brought up, because you hit on so many different things. The Houthis in Yemen, the ongoing war that they've been having with Saudi Arabia, is a perfect example. And yet these proxy forces of the Houthis in Yemen launching missiles, were they really heading towards Israel? I don't know. The question is, were they attacking the ship or were they attacking Israel? Somebody knows the answer to that, but it's not clear at this point. But involving these proxies in different ways around the world can very quickly complicate things. Picture, some big incident in the Persian Gulf, attack on a U.S. ship, name wherever it is. You have a lot of people that are sympathetic to the Hamas cause and to what Iran is doing all around the world. So it brings up possibilities of trouble in lots of places. And this goes back to we need to be prepared, not just militarily, but I think the biggest thing is information, intelligence. We need to have our eyes, ears, and focus out around the world, listening to what's going on, paying attention, and making sure that from a defense perspective in the United States, that we're ready to defend the interests of this country, focusing outward the way that we should be.
General Doug Slocum, our guest. Let's take a quick break, and then on the other side, just a final few minutes, get some final thoughts from you, General, as we continue with some fascinating insights from retired Brigadier General Doug Slocum of the U.S. Air Force, 35-year veteran and a career fighter pilot, joining us here on Denver's local talk leader, 710 KNUS. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, filling in for George Brockler.
Want to take your favorite radio station wherever you go? Well, now there's an app for that. No matter where you are, stream your favorite shows. Tap the app to listen to podcasts. Talk back to your favorite local hosts.
At the tone, leave a message.
Call the show. Set your alarm. Enter contests and win prizes, all in the palm of your hand. Available now for iOS and Android devices in the App Store or Google Play. And best of all, it's free. Download today.
Say goodbye to clutter and hello to convenience when you experience organization transformation in your home. Roll 'em Out Shelves, your clutter transformation experts, create affordable Colorado-crafted organized storage solutions. These custom options will maximize and organize your kitchen and bath storage as Roll 'em Out Shelves carefully designs and builds roll-out drawers to fit your space perfectly to clear the clutter. Contact owners Joyce and Brent at Roll 'em Out Shelves to schedule your free in-home estimate today. Say goodbye to clutter and hello to convenience when you experience organization transformation in your home. Roll 'em Out Shelves, your clutter transformation experts, create affordable Colorado-crafted organized storage solutions. These custom options will maximize and organize your kitchen and bath storage as Roll 'em Out Shelves carefully designs and builds roll-out drawers to fit your space perfectly to clear the clutter. Contact owners Joyce and Brent at Roll 'em Out Shelves to schedule your free in-home estimate today.
Final few minutes of the second hour, Jimmy Sengenberger in for George Brockler. 8 minutes before 8 o'clock, our guest, General Doug Slocum, for the hour. 35-year veteran of the Air Force, career fighter pilot, offering really invaluable perspective and insights this morning. And General, in the beginning of our conversation, you talked about how this was a Kobayashi Maru situation for Israel, sort of like a no-win scenario, as they talk about in Star Trek. But in this case, we're talking real world and a very challenging situation for Israel. We've discussed a variety of different dynamics and aspects, but as this continues, what do you think folks should pay attention to and keep in mind as we observe moving forward?
Wow, that is a great question, Jimmy, because there's a lot that could happen in all of this. Of course, we have to look at the IDF and what are the next steps that they're going to do. They've had to have considered the possibility before when they talk about eliminating Hamas. How are they actually going to go about trying to do that? It's going to be very dangerous, very precarious, and eyes of the world are going to be on what's happening there. So certainly watching the developments in the country itself. Then we take the next layers out. Egypt is a big player in this. We haven't really talked about it all, with the Rafah crossing being closed. Certainly the Palestinian population would be hostile to Egypt. I'm thinking, if they were to try and evacuate people through Rafah into Egypt, that would not be favorable to the Egyptian government. What about the proxies of Hezbollah up in the north in Lebanon, as we see that continue to heat up, as well as developments on the West Bank, continuing these ripples out. When people are distracted, a lot of other things can happen. So, one of the folks that are sitting back, watching, learning, and one of the winners of this whole thing, no matter how you want to look at it, is China, because we're not putting the focus on China. The defense is going to, and a lot of the resources and attention to the Ukraine and to Israel. China, keeping an eye on what's going on there, as well as, of course, in Korea, the ongoing situation in that peninsula. North Korea supplied weapons to Hamas. North Korea is supplying weapons to Russia to help against the Ukraine, and they're continuing to be openly hostile to South Korea. So all these areas, we really have to continue to be diligent, to watch and be ready. We've positioned the USS Ford, the Eisenhower carrier battle group is heading over there, as well as the very capable ships that can not only defend, but they also have very good sensors, airplanes that are capable. Our eyes, ears, and weapons are all on the ready in the area as we go forward.
We've got less than a minute left, but what you're talking about, General Slocum, is how interconnected and interwoven all of these situations are. It is not like what is happening in Israel or Ukraine is just in a vacuum.
Correct. I mean, they all interconnect. It's a very, very small world in today, just in terms of how we can share information and how they all interact. We can ship things anywhere, do stuff. It's an amazing, interwoven, exceptionally complex environment we're dealing with.
Yeah, and especially when you have international actors like Russia and Iran that are engaging in a variety of fronts, that complicates things in ways that we haven't necessarily seen before, given the interwoven nature and the technology and the transportation of goods and so forth that you were just talking about. General Doug Slocum, really appreciate your invaluable time this morning and offering some insights to break down the situation in the war with Israel and Hamas. Thank you so much for taking the time this morning.
Jimmy, it's been a great conversation. Hope I added some value in all this, and thank you for having me on.
You did indeed. We'll definitely have you back once again. Retired Brigadier General Doug Slocum, 35-year Air Force veteran, joining us and offering tremendous insights. Now we turn to you on the other side, 303-696-1971. Jimmy in for George, 710 KNUS. The time is flying by. We are now entering hour number 3 of the George Show. Jimmy Sengenberger filling in for George Brockler here on News Talk 710 KNUS. Of course, host of the Jimmy Sengenberger Show every Saturday morning from 6 to 9. So that means we will be up tomorrow morning, dark and early. Looking forward to continuing the conversation then. What a fascinating hour with retired Brigadier General Doug Slocum, fighter pilot for the Air Force, 35-year career veteran, call sign Odie, by the way. That's a fun little tidbit about him. And I have to say that the insights that he was able to bring were varied. And we were talking with the guys here at the studio off air about how a fighter pilot really brings a unique perspective to these kinds of things. And it really, really showed. We'll talk in a few minutes about the interview with General Slocum, along with you at 303-696-1971. And I'll get some reaction from Bill Thorpe as well on the other side of the glass. But let's go to the phones at 303-696-1971 with Lynn in Denver. Good morning, Lynn. How are you?
I'm great, Jimmy. How are you?
I am doing just fine, thank you. What's going on?
Well, just a reminder, my husband Greg and I met you at the Tommy Castro show.
Yes, absolutely. I remember you. It was great meeting you. Wasn't that a great show? That was a lot of fun.
It was wonderful, yes. And I have to actually run into work. But what I wanted to say, I just heard the end of General Slocum's interview. So many callers to the show and experts and everything say the Ukraine, or worse, the Ukraine. And it hasn't been called that since 1991. It's a sovereign nation, and calling it the is a Soviet construct to minimize its status as a sovereign nation. And, you know, any other country that was consistently mislabeled, that just wouldn't fly.
That's an interesting take. I haven't heard somebody point that out yet, Lynn, so I appreciate you bringing that up. To me, I always just call it Ukraine. Maybe that's because it's been for almost pretty much my entire life. It's been Ukraine, not the Ukraine. I think you're making an interesting observation. Maybe for some people, it's just stuck in their head as lingo. They're used to saying the Ukraine, and so they continue to say it and don't really think much of it. Maybe there are some who have more malicious intent or who would be like, okay, no, I'm sort of adopting the Russian viewpoint. But for most Americans, I don't think that's the case. My guess is it's just something from the lingo that they've used, and they haven't thought otherwise of it.
Yeah, I agree. But when I hear experts doing that, and one host that was subbing for Steph, one host that subbed for Stefan consistently said the Ukraine, and that's an intentional mispronunciation of the country's name. Yeah. And it's just, you know, we just got back from there from a humanitarian trip, and really? We're a little sensitive.
Lynn, you'll have to call back in sometime when you have more time, because I would love to get your perspective on what's going on the ground in Ukraine.
Sure.
So
love to.
Definitely. Hey, thank you. It was great seeing you guys at the Tommy Castro concert. Give my best to Greg.
I sure will. Thanks so much.
Thank you. 303-696-1971 is our telephone number if you want to join in to the program. Yeah, I always love that. Tommy Castro's a blues man who came to town. In fact, he has an album called Blues Man. A Blues Man Came to Town a couple of weeks ago, and just a tremendous show. I got, actually not even a couple of weeks ago, last Friday, a week ago today. And I had the opportunity to sit in with him on harmonica. I'd met a handful of listeners there, which is always great. 303-696-1971, our telephone number. You can text into the show on the 710 KNUS app on your smartphone. Name and town, please, if you wish to text in. A couple of texts here. One, the attack on Israel was horrific. So is the horrific war against Ukraine. Why is the outrage over Israel so much greater? This is Sue's from Denver. I think that's an interesting question. I would say that it probably relates more to the long-standing relationship and closeness between the U.S. and Israel, that it has to do with the fact that we have for decades and decades had that expectation that we will be there for Israel, that they are our ally, that we have this close bond and relationship. I think that there is also actually, I'll expand on that and say there's this understanding that our support is necessary for Israel, whereas Ukraine is a different situation for a lot of Americans who don't really understand the connection there or what is going on in terms of its significance to the global stage and to American policy interests. It's easier to see that for Israel, but also it's the only Jewish state. And there is this very close and significant bond between Christians and Jews. And there is that relationship inherently that I think comes into play. So when you see this attack, you see Americans recoil and say, we need to be there and support you. But we also see the barbarism, the level of barbarism on display, and how vicious it really is with Hamas, a kind of barbarism that we did see on September 11th, 2001. So for a lot of Americans, I think there's a more visceral connection. Oh, jihadist terrorism. We know what that's like. We experienced it on 9/11/01 and in wars since then. And so I think there's a real connection between the U.S. and Israel on a number of levels that probably explains how the outrage over Israel in the United States is greater. If you look over in Europe, their concern over Ukraine is especially pronounced. Now, it also is in Israel, France, and Germany as two examples of countries deeply concerned about Israel. Bibi Netanyahu just met with the Chancellor of Germany, for example. So there is a significance there. But in terms of Ukraine, they know in Europe what the implications are of a country like Ukraine falling. I remember when I was a year ago in Ukraine or in Taiwan, and I met a couple of journalists from the press tour that I was on, a couple of journalists who were from the Czech Republic and from Bulgaria, who grew up in the former Soviet Union and who understood and were fearful of the prospect of Russia taking over Ukraine. And if that were to happen, then the dominoes that would fall are, in their mind, real, especially given the ambitions of Vladimir Putin to be a 21st century Peter the Great. 303-696-1971, our telephone number. Let's go next to Frank in Golden. Good morning, Frank. You're on with Jimmy and for George.
Hey, Jimmy. I'm recognizing that there's a lot bigger problems in the world and some more immediate issues, but I don't know if anybody's mentioned or noticed that Sidney Powell apparently cut a deal and rolled over on the RICO case in Georgia.
We talked about it a little bit yesterday, actually, on the program, particularly in the 9 o'clock hour after the news broke with syndicated columnist Ruben Navarrete, and we may touch on it again in the next couple of hours. Well, what are your thoughts, Frank, on that real quick?
Oh, I think this spells some real trouble for, Donald Trump and the rest of the cult. I mean, I think that obviously when you have a criminal defendant, a group of criminal defendants charged in a RICO situation like this, as soon as one goes away, caves in, rolls over, however you want to describe it, I think it was more or less that she didn't cut a deal. She just surrendered. Mm-hmm. But it creates obviously a lot more pressure on everybody else involved and makes their cases much more hard to defend.
It was a plea deal, and I think that they had worked out some of the specifics. She doesn't have jail time. She's got, probation and fines and so forth. So there was definitely a deal there. She didn't just say, hey, I'm turning myself in and leaving it at that. She reached a plea deal, but she pled guilty.
Surrender. I mean,
okay. Sure.
Surrendered with terms. But it's obvious now that there's these other defendants are all going to point in a direction, and that phone call to the Georgia Secretary of State is really
not good.
No, I mean this is this is a problem, and I don't, I haven't heard a whole lot about it because obviously there's bigger problems.
Yeah,
going on right now.
I know the amount of news going on this week in stories is staggering, but we did hit on it yesterday, and here we are, Frank, touching on it again with you. Thanks for the call. I appreciate it.
Yep.
303-696-1971, our telephone number. You're welcome to call in on the topic of the Sidney Powell plea deal. Remember, this is the lawyer for Trump who had the Kraken she was going to release, and then she had the Kraken she was going to release. She was going to prove everything, and it never happened. And here she is reaching a plea deal yesterday in the Georgia case. Of course, we spent the last hour talking with General Slocum about the war in Gaza. And one of the points that he raised was how interwoven all of these things are. When you look at Hamas and Hezbollah, and you look at Iran and their role, and you see what's happening now with the U.S. Navy warship near Yemen intercepting multiple missiles that were potentially fired toward Israel, we've got a wider scope of things that are going on. And I think his insights were excellent in terms of some of the tactical pieces here. And he called it a Kobayashi Maru scenario for Israel. And that really is, that's a no-win scenario. It harkens back, as Bill and I were talking off air as well, to Star Trek and the Kobayashi Maru scenario, where Captain Kirk was able to manipulate the scenario to his advantage so that he could win the simulation. But this is the real world. It's a different story. Bill, I would love to get your reaction a little bit to General Slocum as well, because there was just so much that we packed into that conversation. I strongly encourage folks who missed it to go back to the podcast for the 7 o'clock hour. But one of the things that was especially striking to me was how many challenges, as he laid out, Israel really does have, even though they have tremendous capabilities and experience fighting against these terrorists.
Yeah, I've been a little surprised, given how many challenges the U.S. faced in fighting an urban type of warfare in Iraq and to a lesser extent in Afghanistan. I've been very surprised how many people are just thinking, well, Israel's just got to go in there and crush them right now.
Right.
This is simple, as if we were playing some sort of an old-fashioned board game of Stratego. That's not what we're doing. And this is much more difficult, especially as the general laid out that how Gaza is set up is different strategically than a usual urban combat scenario, because they have built for this. They have built to make sure the civilians and the civilian infrastructure provides a barrier. So they have gone in this specifically. You're not just going house to house looking for insurgents. You're going to have to go underground. You're going to have to figure out where tunnels go. There is a system they've set up in anticipation of this. They've already planned for this game, and now you're coming into it late. I appreciated that. I appreciated the idea and how he approached intelligence. Because that has been my feeling, is you got to wonder, the IDF is one of the most advanced, complex, and efficient intelligence gathering organizations on the planet. They are ridiculously good at it. Better in some areas, in my opinion, than even we are. They have some advantages, and they've done some stuff that we only would dream of being able to do, but they missed this. How could they be so blind? And what I really appreciated is when he talked about how low tech Hamas went in order to start the attacks and how to get everything across the line. And that's been my thought. Again, I'm not saying that I'm right, but my thought was the reason Israel lost this and missed this attack was because they ignored the low tech information they were getting. They had leaned too far into the high tech. They weren't seeing things on Discord channels. They weren't seeing emails. They weren't seeing a lot of electronic communications and files passed between each other, where Hamas, in my opinion, went very old school. This was a person-to-person, passing probably written notes and stacks of paper to people and getting together, because Gaza is a small area, getting very easy to concentrate all the players that you need into a meeting or getting everybody in charge of those players in a meeting, in a room, somewhere underground. That's very easy tactically. And I just am convinced that Israel missed a lot of the low-tech signs that this was coming, just like we did with 9/11. Well, we didn't realize it's a little weird when the guys are learning to fly the planes they don't want to land.
Right.
I mean, we missed that. That is an easy catch, but we missed that low-tech solution.
Yeah, well, one of the things that he pointed out and really emphasized was how so much of this, especially given that technology and the internet, is really a PR battle. And that hospital was a prime example where Islamic Jihad misfires a rocket. It hits this hospital, but the stories out there with the Hamas propaganda that this was Israel and that it was done in an intentional attack to kill hundreds and hundreds of innocent Palestinians, and the cat's out of the bag in a way that isn't true. It's not actually the case that happened, but turning back that clock when it's already out there, especially when you have so many in the media that have done a terrible job in terms of correcting the record on this, allowing it to spread. I mean, it is such a crucial point that he raised about what he called the PR battle or lawfare.
I go into Stephen Colbert, and when this is previous to when he was being the night host, when he was doing his Bill O'Reilly impression,
the Colbert Report,
and he was talking about it being truthiness. That as long as it feels right, it is truth to you.
Yes.
And he brought that type of an idea up, and that's what we are experiencing here. And that's what you're seeing, because it is truthiness on the Arab front, because they don't want to believe that someone that they side with or sympathize with would make a mistake that would lead to these kind of deaths. It is much easier to believe the people that you want eradicated off the planet in the country that you don't want to exist, they're the evil ones in this. You already believe they are. So it is much easier to get to that point than it is to get to what actually happened. And the problem being, it doesn't matter how much information Israel puts out. Doesn't matter how much information the United States puts out. It doesn't matter how much any information any other nation puts out, even an Arab nation, because the first thing they're going to do is say, well, that can be manipulated. Don't you know about movies and CGIs? The Americans can do anything they want. We've seen the Hollywood movies. We've seen them make superheroes fly through the sky.
Right.
They can make this. This is obviously done, and they did this just to make us feel bad. They will ignore it based on that. And for everyone that's saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe that would happen. Oh my gosh, why can't the Arabs open their eyes? I got 2 words for you. Election fraud. How many times in this country did we have things that were postulated, things that were supposed to have happened, and then when information came forward and directly contradicted those conclusions, people made up an excuse? That wasn't obviously it. They manipulated that. We were shown in Georgia that Giuliani and the president's lawyers manipulated video to make it look like people were putting boxes of ballots under a table and then pulling them out later to make the election fraudulent. Georgia election officials walked people through the full video. You can see the full video and watch what happens with the ballots.
Right.
You can see the boxes. They have been verified and checked, but that didn't matter, because as soon as someone was confronted with the idea that what they believed they saw wasn't true, they then made up another excuse.
Right.
And they still ignore it. I still get phone calls over here on this phone about people using the boxes under the desks in Georgia as an example, years after it was proven to be a lie. So before we sit there and say, how come the Arab world is believing this? Election fraud.
Well, and I will never forget when I had Tina Peters in studio during her primary run for Secretary of State on my Saturday show. And I pressed her on some of the facts and the reports that she claimed had been put out with proof. And she could not address in any way directly any of the claims that I was pushing back on, and then threatened to walk out of the interview after that segment. And then it was strike. The only time I've ever had somebody threaten to walk out of an interview was with Tina Peters. And it was because she brought it up. I had to push back.
Yeah.
And she didn't have any response. And that was one of the lead purveyors of these conspiracy theories.
It's just like the movie 2000 Mules. I still get that one as well, despite the fact that the director has openly admitted on these airwaves that in that movie, there's no proof of a single fraudulent ballot being cast. Not a proof of a single ballot being cast, not proof of these supposed mules making these trips more than once. The premise was faulty, but I still get phone calls about it. So
well, and
that's why
your point that, okay, then you have the world and the dynamics in the Middle East in play, and these videos and the claims that are made. And yeah, it's an interesting point that you have to be able to recognize, okay, I get how they can have this perception and how it will stick.
Yeah. And he was good. I also liked some of the idea of some of the strategy about how Israel needs to approach, but not come in necessarily with a sledgehammer. You can't come in there and say, okay, we're going to start this ground offensive, Hulk smash.
Yeah, he made the point about 1991 in the Gulf War, that for the U.S., before they put folks on the ground, troops on the ground, you had this air focus that lasted as long as they needed to before they said, okay, it's time where we can put the invasion forces on the ground.
Yep, and that's been very interesting for me because I've been very curious about, because it's a small geographic area, why the air power from the Israelis? I mean, why the overwhelming? And it seems to me, again, I'm not a military strategist, but the dangers of collateral damage and turning hearts and minds because of that collateral damage, to me, outweighs the use of it on Israel's side. But after hearing his explanation as to why and what you need in preview to the ground war, it makes sense.
Yeah.
That sets right in my mind. Now I understand, because before I was viewing it as Israel making a PR blunder and not necessarily advancing their goals that much. But now I see it. I get it now. I see why this is advancing their goal and setting the table for a potential invasion. It makes sense.
And that's why having a guy with a keen tactical mind and such in-depth experience as General Slocum is so helpful. That's for darn sure. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, filling in for George Brockler. Thank you, Billy, for chiming in this morning. What are your thoughts? 303-696-1971. There's a lot of news of the day. You can text in on the 710 KNUS app on your smartphone. Name in town. If you wish to text in, please. We'll pick up the conversation on the other side. Jimmy in for George, 710 KNUS. Rocking back, Jimmy Sengenberger in for George Brockler. 35 minutes after 8 o'clock. News Talk 710 KNUS. Thanks for joining us. It's going to be a hot one today. We're talking sunny and 83 degrees as we get into the latter half of October. More concretely. Good to be with you along for the ride here on the program. 303-696-1971, our telephone number. Listener text coming in as well via the 710 KNUS app on your smartphone. Please name and town if you wish to text in. You've mentioned the link between Saudi diplomacy. That would be the possibility of normalizing relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and Hamas attacks. How could they have been planned? How could they have planned such an attack for that day? So what we know is that this has been in the works for 2 years. So it's not like they cooked up all the specifics within 24 hours. They had it planned within 2 years. When you have an operation ready to go, it's just a matter of when you decide to give the go-ahead. And I think that there are multiple reasons why that weekend was the right weekend. You had multiple Jewish holidays, right weekend from their twisted mindset, because you had multiple Jewish holidays. You had and you had the Saudi dynamic here. I mean, within a week, what happened? Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, put out a statement saying he was putting these negotiations on ice. It happened. They got what they wanted in that regard. And certainly it was a piece of the plan from early on. Because when we look at Iran's motivations here, I mean, the rivalry is between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That's a significant rivalry here. In fact, we see it playing out in a proxy war in Yemen between the government there and the Houthi rebels. The Houthis are backed by Iran, and the government there is backed by Saudi Arabia. There's a proxy war going on between those two. There's a lot of complications and complexities in terms of why this is the case. It has to do a lot with Sunnis versus Shias and in terms of the sects of Islam. But when we look at the rivalry and the power structure, Iran is the power, the sort of Shia hegemon, and Saudi Arabia is the Sunni hegemon. But it's bigger than this, because let's go back to the Abraham Accords. The Trump administration comes in, they recognize a couple of things. One, the way that they have approached Mideast policy at the federal level, that the U.S. government has approached Mideast policy, hasn't worked, particularly as it relates to Israel and the Arab countries. What they also recognize is that there were a lot of back-channel conversations that were going on at the time already between Israel and Arab states because of Iran and because of the Iranian nuclear deal that failed, that Obama put into place. So the Trump administration said, okay, what can we do here? Well, let's go to Saudi Arabia and say, hey, is it okay? Well, Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries, is it possible to reach deals with Israel? We want to bolster you against Iran because of your concerns. We're withdrawing from the Iranian nuclear deal. We're showing you that we're on your side in this vis-a-vis Iran. What can we do to bring about normalization of relations that were already starting to happen a little bit behind closed doors in back-channel discussions? And then it grew from there, and we ultimately had the Abraham Accords with the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, several Arab countries that made peace with Israel. And that's concerning to Iran because that means that they don't have this common enemy in Israel that they did before. Because the real common enemy for Israel and the Arab countries is Iran. It's the old Arab proverb, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the common enemy in this case is Iran. And so you have the dynamics that we've seen unfold over the past few years. And then Saudi Arabia increasingly is open to normalizing relations with Israel, to actually forming relations that have never been in place before. And so Iran is concerned about that. And of course, they are going to want to act through their proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, the Houthis in Yemen, in whatever way to prevent that peace from happening. That's a piece. That's not the only thing. There are multiple facets to this, of course. It's a multifaceted, multi-layered issue. But there is a key piece of this that has to do with the Saudi diplomacy, and the timing is more than a coincidence. But that doesn't mean that the planning happened overnight. It happened for a couple of years. They wanted to send a clear message to Saudi Arabia, don't do this, and put them on the spot. You really want to choose Israel over Muslims? That's the idea here in the region that's significant. And that's why it really does matter. Now, last night, President Biden spoke in a 17-minute address, 16 minutes or so, about Israel as well as Ukraine. And he made this particular case about why Israel and Ukraine both matter.
I know these conflicts can seem far away. And it's natural to ask, why does this matter to America? So let me share with you why making sure Israel and Ukraine succeed is vital for America's national security. You know, history has taught us that when terrorists don't pay a price for their terror, when dictators don't pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos and death and more destruction. They keep going, and the cost and the threats to America and the world keep rising. So if we don't stop Putin's appetite for power and control in Ukraine, he won't limit himself just to Ukraine. Putin's already threatened to remind Poland that their Western land was a gift from Russia. One of his top advisors, a former president of Russia, has called Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania Russia's Baltic provinces. These are all NATO allies. For 75 years, NATO has kept peace in Europe and has been the cornerstone of American security. And if Putin attacks a NATO ally, we will defend every inch of NATO which the treaty requires and calls for. We'll have something that we do not seek. Make it clear, we do not seek. We do not seek to have American troops fighting in Russia or fighting against Russia.
And he compared Hamas and Putin.
Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy, completely annihilate it.
What do you make of the connection, the bridge that Biden brought between Israel and Ukraine in his speech last night? Should it have been solely about Israel? Or did it make sense for him to finally make a case, at least somewhat, to the American people directly in a primetime speech for why we need to continue our involvement in and support for Ukraine? What are your thoughts on that? 303-696-1971. You can text in 710K and US app. Name and town if you wish to do so, please. We're going to take a break. On the other side, we'll pick up the conversation. Jimmy Sengenberger in for George Brockler here on Denver's local talk leader, News Talk 710 KNUS. 9 minutes before 9 o'clock, Jimmy Sengenberger filling in for George Brockler this morning. News Talk 710 KNUS happening now on the House floor. Former Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy is giving his speech nominating Jim Jordan for Speaker in the third round of voting. Isn't this really interesting? Just seeing McCarthy, who was just deposed as Speaker just a couple of weeks ago, now nominating the guy who is struggling mightily to become Speaker of the House. Will Republicans sew this up? What is going to happen? We will see, and we will discuss more in the next hour. But when we went to break, we played a couple of clips of Biden explaining the connection between American support for Israel and American support for Ukraine. Here's another little sample of that.
American leadership is what holds the world together. American alliances are what keep us, America, safe. American values are what make us a partner that other nations want to work with. To put all that at risk, if we walk away from Ukraine, if we turn our backs on Israel, it's just not worth it. That's why tomorrow I'm going to send to Congress an urgent budget request to fund America's national security needs, to support our critical partners, including Israel and Ukraine. It's a smart investment that's going to pay dividends for American security for generations. Help us keep American troops out of harm's way. Help us build a world that is safer, more peaceful, more prosperous for our children and grandchildren.
Why do this? Listener text 710K and US app. Biden is declaring Ukraine and Gaza the same conflict. Not sure that's a good strategy. I'm not hearing him saying that Ukraine and Israel and what's happening in those allies and our support for both countries is the same conflict. What he is doing is connecting the two in terms of their significance to American interests, in terms of national security, and in terms of the need to support those who are fighting for freedom and independence. That is true. He is not wrong at all in connecting those two. But let's talk about the strategy. Why did Biden do this? There are a couple of reasons. One, as I suggested before, he has not really made the case, at least in quite a while, to the American people for why our involvement in Ukraine and our support for Ukrainian independence from Russia is so crucial. He needed to make that case in a primetime address. Last night provided the opportunity, especially because there is a connection between those battles. They are different, and our reasons for supporting Israel are on some level different from Ukraine, especially when we are talking about the jihadist aspects with Israel and with it being the Jewish state, the one Jewish state, and our long-term ally going back since the formation of Israel in the late 1940s. And other dynamics, of course, that are in play. But even so, there is a connection between the two in terms of freedom, in terms of the struggle against tyranny and the struggle against brutality.
Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy, completely annihilate it.
So you need to be fighting that fight. Listener texting in, that's the same in my mind. Okay, fair enough. You want to say that that's the same conflict. But the important thing is that Biden is making that connection because the American people need to know why we are supporting two countries at this moment in their wars. But the other thing, this is the political tactic here. Biden knows that the Republicans do not have a Speaker of the House. Maybe McCarthy's speech will win the day. He is praising Jim Jordan right now on the floor of the House during their debate and discussion over Speaker of the House and what to do next. But if Republicans don't get it together, then Biden's going to be able to say, look, I told you about the connections between Israel and Ukraine and why both of those wars matter to American interests and why we need to support them as our allies. And the Republicans don't have a leader in place, a Speaker of the House, to be able to get that aid to those countries. Putting Republicans in a box last night. Putting Republicans in a box. We're going to go out to the break listening to a little bit of Kevin McCarthy on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. We've got a lot to talk about in the final hour. Give us a call, 303-696-1971. Text in on the 710KNUS app. Jimmy in for George, 710KNUS.
To this conference or this country. After the race, I became leader and we had an opening for the ranking member on House Oversight. Jim didn't even apply for the job. I walked into steering. Didn't tell steering. I walked into the other room and I picked up the phone and I called Jim.
All right, it's the final hour. Jimmy Sengenberger filling in for George Brockler today. News Talk 710 KNUS. Our telephone number 303-696-1971. Tomorrow I'm back at it from 6 until 9. We are seeing right now on the floor Catherine Clark, Democratic House Minority Whip, just gave her speech nominating Hakeem Jeffries for Speaker of the House. Let's be real. It's all performative. Now, maybe McCarthy's speech will move the needle. He spoke at the end of the last hour on the floor nominating Jim Jordan. We will know soon, once they have their vote, as to whether or not McCarthy's speech made any difference. As of now, I don't think so. It doesn't seem like it. But that is the only speech that might matter on the floor of the House. As they go through additional rounds, any more speeches is a waste of time. Just do the vote and negotiate. Do the vote and negotiate. Do whatever you need to do to get this done and sewed up, because the House has business to get taken care of. Whether that is aid packages for Israel and Ukraine, which need to be passed. I think the Biden folks are now proposing $105 billion in support here in a sweeping aid package that they have asked for. And I'm not sure what else is included in terms of the components there, but I think it's more than just support for Israel and Ukraine. But also, there's the fiscal situation, the possibility of a government shutdown, and so forth. This needs to get sorted out. The vote is underway. Third vote for House Speaker. And before we know it, we will have those results. It'll be interesting to see what happens. And if, for example, Ken Buck changes his vote at any point. 303-696-1971 is our telephone number if you'd like to join in to the festivities. He's been waiting for a while on hold. Let's go to Ben in Morrison. Good morning, Ben. How are you?
Good. How about you?
I'm doing just fine. So what's on your mind, sir?
Well, I think we absolutely need to have at least some semblance of presence in Ukraine and also in Israel.
I agree.
And then I also think Jim Jordan probably doesn't have a shot at getting the speakership. So they might need to move on to someone else. So.
I think we'll know more in this third round if anything has changed. If not, I think you're probably right that he will not be speaker, but you never know what is going to happen. It's topsy-turvy there. But I want to focus on, because this is what I saw you had originally called about, on Israel and Ukraine. What are you looking at here from your vantage point, Ben?
Well, I'm looking at Putin, first of all, in Ukraine. His border does not stop in Ukraine.
Yes.
He's trying to reestablish the USSR. So he's going to go from there. And then if he goes from there, he's probably going to go into the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and look at one of those next. And those are NATO nations. So as soon as that happens, it kicks in an agreement, from the NATO allies that we have to respond to this. And what happens if the U.S. decides to duck out of that is it shows that the U.S. isn't a trustworthy nation. We can't be relied upon. We're flimsy. We're wimpy. We fake our agreements that we've established with other nations. So that's my issue with that one.
Yeah. So does this mean in your mind, Ben, then that by supporting Ukraine at this moment and thereby preventing Russia from being able to expand into other countries, specifically NATO allies, that it prevents the U.S. from having no choice but to get into a direct military conflict, such as troops on the ground and so forth, in pursuance of the commitments that we've made to NATO?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good point.
And then in Israel, that one's way more complicated, so much more complicated, because right now, to this a little bit earlier, they have this mass network of underground tunnels that are running through that Gaza Strip where they're holding arms, munitions, all this other stuff. And they're basically using civilians as kind of a human shield. where,
Not
you can't just
basically,
go.
literally. They literally are using civilians as human shields. Be clear.
Yeah, so you can't just do a drone strike and just we're going to bomb their munitions plant because it might be underground underneath like a hospital or something or a school or some area where we can't really like access it, and if we don't know the access points to those tunnels. So
well, and this is why General Slocum, Doug Slocum, in the second hour, in the 7 o'clock hour, pointed out why the delay in the invasion has happened. That is to say, why Israel has not yet invaded Gaza, although the government is still letting troops know, hey, be ready. Their words, be ready for this invasion. And it is because there are so many complexities on the ground with the tunnel network and more that you're talking about, Ben, that they have to address things from the air in these ways first. It's like he made the comparison to the first Gulf War and how we were in the air far longer before we made that pivot into having troops on the ground. And there are certain things to be taken care of before you can be ready, tactically speaking, for that ground invasion.
Yeah. And the issue is Israel is absolutely the minority in that region. They're a Jewish state and surrounded by Muslim countries.
The Jewish state. Yeah.
And
right.
If they do anything that comes down, like they're looking like a sledgehammer coming down on Muslim people, killing civilians, doing anything that looks atrocious, they're going to make everyone else around them very, very mad. So there's Syria, there's Jordan. They have a bunch of borders with all these other nations. And I've seen it already here in the US. Like there was a kid, I think it was in Chicago, maybe a 6-year-old kid that got stabbed by somebody's landlord. And that's how you radicalize people. Do stuff like that.
Well, and this is why the hospital blast was so crucial, because in this PR battle, as the general put it, or lawfare fight, and that is because even though Israel did not do a strike on the hospital, it was a misfired rocket from Islamic Jihad. The word was already spread, and for many, it is too late. Israel is responsible, and they're not turning back the clock on that in their minds. This is why Israel does go through, Ben, great pains to avoid human casualties among civilians as much as possible.
Yeah, I saw that in the news, and I was like, oh God, please tell me Israel didn't do this. Please tell me Israel didn't do this. And I was waiting to kind of figure out more information on that, because I was like, this is just going to kick the hornet's nest if you did that, if you bombed a hospital. So you really have to be very surgical on how you do this stuff, like in that Gaza Strip, and make sure you're very, very precise. Because like I said, you're in the minority in that region, and you have a bunch of people that don't like you.
Yeah. No, that's
surrounding
true.
you.
I'm going to have to run here in a moment, Ben, but I have a question for you. Did you watch Biden's speech last night?
No, I didn't get a chance to.
Okay. So I played a couple of clips, I think you heard, though, of him making comparisons, bridging together the war in Israel, Gaza, with the war in Ukraine. Do you think that it was wise and the right way to go for him to bring Ukraine into this so much last night, or should he have focused on Israel?
I'd keep both of them together. I think it's our international interest to be involved in both of those situations. Israel we're a stronger ally with than I think Ukraine. Ukraine is kind of someone we're semi-friendly with, but not like a strong ally. Israel we're a strong ally. So I guess it depends on Israel's situation. I'd see what they want to do, how much involvement they want from us, and go from there. Whereas Ukraine's a much more simple situation. It's an unprovoked attack from Russia.
Both are unprovoked attacks. Let's be clear about that, but please continue.
But one's a nation state, one's a militant group.
Right.
Within the country. Yeah. So one's trying to basically take over the country, and the other one's also this terrorist,
They want to destroy the country. They want to eradicate the country in the case of Hamas.
They want to eradicate all the Jews.
Yes.
So it's one's a genocide situation by probably a small faction, of the Gaza Strip, and the other one's like an entire nation state actually involving. So it's
sure. No, I can understand
different.
that. Both
I
are
know.
significant. I agree that the U.S. has a need to be involved in providing support to both Israel and Ukraine. Ben, hey, I appreciate the call. Thank you. Have a great one. 303-696-1971 is our telephone number if you want to join in to the conversation. So at some point, who knows, Israel will embark on a ground invasion. It is not time quite yet, but they are saying be ready. Meanwhile, the fight continues between Hamas and Israel, and it will not end anytime soon. Israel is not going to back down. Now, Biden made it clear in his speech last night about the hospital that we were talking about that it was not Israel that did the strike.
I also spoke with President Abbas, the Palestinian Authority, and reiterated that the United States remains committed to the Palestinian people's right to dignity and to self-determination. The actions of Hamas terrorists don't take that right away. Like so many other, I'm heartbroken by the tragic loss of Palestinian life, including the explosion at the hospital in Gaza, which was not done by the Israelis. We mourn every innocent life lost. We can't ignore the humanity of innocent Palestinians who only want to live in peace and have an opportunity.
So I can understand that point. First of all, saying a little bit about minimizing human casualties among civilians, and that this is not about going after all Palestinians. This is about taking on Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which are allies of Hamas, which are also proxies of Israel. And I'm glad that he made the point there and stressed a little bit, hey, this was not Israel that did the strike on the hospital. It was, well, he didn't say it was a misfired rocket from Islamic Jihad. I would have liked him to say otherwise, but at least he clarified this was not Israel. The big thing, I was not concerned or frustrated with him bridging Ukraine and Israel. I think there's reason for that. There's cause for that. But he did do it a little bit much. I would have emphasized Israel more in the speech than he did. However, what bugged me more was the fact that he played this game of both sidism way too much as far as the Palestinians and the situation there versus Israel, and undercut some of the heinous barbarism and war crimes committed by Hamas. But I also think he undersold the need to stamp out anti-Semitism right in this moment.
We must, without equivocation, denounce anti-Semitism. We must also, without equivocation, denounce Islamophobia.
So I have nothing against making it clear in general. Islamophobia, unacceptable. Anti-Semitism, unacceptable. Racism, unacceptable. The list goes on. Hatred, bigotry in any form is unacceptable. But right now, what we have distinctly in the globe and in this country is a startling rise, specifically in anti-Semitism, that is growing on college campuses and many other quarters, to the point where there are posters being put up. I've been talking about this. Posters being put up, like at New York University, showing kidnapped Israelis, Americans, and others who were abducted by Hamas. And those posters being torn down. New York University, in London, and other places in the United States. Just as one example, the disgusting and vile memes that we are seeing, the comments that are being flippantly made, the way in which we see some politicians talking about Israel and spreading anti-Semitic tropes. Case in point, Tim Hernandez, Colorado State Representative, or Rashida Tlaib, Congresswoman for I think Michigan, right? Or Minnesota. Michigan. It's Ilhan Omar, who's from Minnesota. And this congresswoman still refuses to acknowledge that Israel did not strike the hospital. Biden should have put his emphasis on anti-Semitism. And that should have been the big focus of his speech relative to any sort of hatred, to Jew hatred that is expanding. And that has been going on for millennia. And that needed to be the point of emphasis. And he played this game of both sidism or two issues way too much. And that was something that disappointed me in the speech. Maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. Give me a call if you agree or disagree. 303-696-1971. But I thought that there was way too little emphasis on the anti-Semitism piece and too much bringing in other issues. But as for Ukraine, I don't think he was wrong to link it together, and probably good political strategy. Jordan already appearing to Jim Jordan fall short of the votes needed. So far, they still have quite a ways to go, but you already have, by my math here, 12 Republicans who have voted for others, whether that's Steve Scalise, Kevin McCarthy, or others. And so part of the reason that Biden would bring in Ukraine and Israel in the speech was to put Republicans on the spot. Where are you with the House of Representatives and getting your leadership sorted out so you can get your literal house in order and get on these aid packages that are needed and put Republicans on the spot for both Israel and Ukraine? Is smart political strategy in addition to the genuine idea of how these wars are interconnected and how they both matter to U.S. policy. And here's the problem. Republicans are giving rhetorical ammunition to Biden and the Democrats right as we speak. Right at this moment, on the floor of the House of Representatives, Republicans are giving rhetorical ammunition to the Democrats on a potential government shutdown and on these wars. Figure it out, House GOP. Because I still don't know which is worse, which is more dysfunctional right now. The House Republicans, the Colorado GOP, or the Denver Public Schools Board of Education. Right at this moment, it kind of seems like the House GOP might be more dysfunctional. Get it together, folks. 303-696-1971, our telephone number. What are your thoughts? Agree, disagree? Give us a call. You can text it on the 710KNUS app on your smartphone. Name and town, if you wish to text in. Keep it right here. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, in for George Brockler, Denver's local talk leader, News Talk 710 KNUS.
Want to take your favorite radio station wherever you go? Well, now there's an app for that. No matter where you are, stream your favorite shows. Tap the app to listen to podcasts. Talk back to your favorite local hosts.
At the tone, leave a message.
Call the show. Set your alarm. Enter contests and win prizes, all in the palm of your hand. Available now for iOS and Android devices in the App Store or Google Play. And best of all, it's free. Download today.
Bottom of the 9 o'clock hour, Jimmy Sengenberger in for George Brockler. Tom Petty with You Don't Know How It Feels. Ben I used to be in. We would perform this. I did the harmonica in it and had a really fun extra solo in it. It's a great tune to play. That's for darn sure. And to listen to. Welcome back again. Jimmy Sengenberger in for George Brockler. 710 KNUS. Thanks so much for joining us and being a part of the program. Again, our telephone number 303-696-1971 as we continue the conversation and turn to Nick in Denver. Good morning, Nick. How's it going?
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call. And
You
I'm
bet.
kind of an armchair a military person, so I know just enough to be dangerous. But I think I just think that the Israelis need to take a long pause before they get into Gaza, because the Palestinians have been preparing for this for decades, and it's just
so has Israel.
US
Let's be clear, though,
What?
and Israel has as well. Israel's constantly preparing, hence things like the Iron Dome. But please
Right.
continue.
No, and militarily speaking, the last kind of warfare you want to get into is street fighting, urban fighting, house to house, because your casualties just go through the roof. And I just hope they come up with some creative way of neutralizing that whole area to avoid a ground war. That's all. I don't know what that is. I have kind of some crazy ideas, but the last thing you want is for this thing to spiral out of control, and now you have a big war.
Well, and I think, Nick, that Israel is certainly cognizant of this. They don't want that because
Right.
they know that could be detrimental to not just the short-term interests that they have, but their long-term interests. I mean, we are talking about a situation on the ground that is perilous. And as you pointed out, this is clearly, I mean, this particular attack, Hamas has planned for 2 years. But this is why, going back to General Slocum and his arguments made in the 7 o'clock hour, if you missed that, I strongly encourage you to go check the podcast, and I may play some clips tomorrow on my show. But he made the point that, like 1991 for America in the first Gulf War, we had our air component first for as long as that needed to be, and to do that strategically and very well. And then we were in position to send in the ground troops. Israel, he said, is making that same calculus and doing things by air and so forth as much as they can before they go in with the ground invasion, which is why the invasion has not happened yet. There will be a point in time soon at which the Israelis need to do something on the ground, but they're not haphazardly going to do it in accordance with the argument I think that you're making, Nick.
One of the people that I listen to very as much as possible, and I think you might agree, is Dennis Prager, because he does a lot of he really does a lot of thinking about topics. And he basically said that you have one intractable problem in the Middle East. You've got a group of countries that would like to see every Jew dead, and the other country wants to just survive. And as long as you have that mindset, you've got a problem. You've got a serious problem. And that's what the Israelis are up against. The other side wants them all dead. They don't want them to survive. They don't want their little bitty country. They just want them dead and gone.
Right.
That's what you're up against.
No, that's true. It's from the river to the sea, they say, and that specifically refers to the eradication of Israel and supplanting it with a Palestinian state.
Yes.
And by the way, that kind of rhetoric is perpetuated by Americans like the Democratic Socialists of America, and State Representative Elizabeth Epps has tweeted that out in the past. Like that anti-Semitism is alive and well. And it is disgusting, alive and well here in the United States. And
unfortunately, yes.
Yes, it is. Tragic. Nick, hey, great call. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Take care.
We also have a listener text coming in saying Israel has a lot of experience with house to house. Yes, that's true. They certainly do. But they know what the conditions need to be before they can send their troops in and start doing house to house and hospital to hospital or whatever it is. They know what those conditions will need to be before they take that step. Going back to my concerns about Biden going way too far in terms of comparisons last night, basically putting on the same level playing field right at this moment, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. John in Littleton, thank you for saying your name and town. I do appreciate it in your text. Saying, is this Biden's good people on both sides moment? In some respects, you could see that sort of situation. I don't think he went that far. It wasn't pro Hamas, but it was similar in the sense of, let me put in an equation and not just focus on the particular group that is aggrieved right now, but broaden it out into these other aspects. And I think that was a mistake on his part. Then here's a question that came in earlier from Don in Sallisaw, Oklahoma, formerly Aurora. Again, thanks for the name and town in your text, Don. Jimmy, are you going to talk about Ken Buck's speaker vote? What is his plan to move forward? Is it time to primary Buck? I still have interest in Colorado and will support the opposition in a primary. I don't know. I mean, we'll have to see. But right now, how is this a primary when you don't have, I guess you have one guy who's announced who I'd never heard of, but you don't really have a primary going on here.
Jimmy, I got a question.
Go ahead, Bill.
I got a question for the texter on that one. Why is this a primary issue? Why is
a primary issue?
Yeah, why is this the linchpin that you're like, oh, he's not voting for Jim Jordan or he's not voting for this? Why is this the primary issue for you? Because remember, this was a move by Matt Gaetz and his friends in order to weaken McCarthy, and it was a move done solely by Matt Gaetz without any plan beyond removing McCarthy that put us in this situation. This is not Buck's fault.
You know what? You know what's striking? Now, Buck was one of the 8, though, who did vote to remove McCarthy. So but folks can look at it from either way. It's just striking to me that people who are attacking Ken Buck now for not getting on board with Jim Jordan were praising him and saying it's great that you voted to remove McCarthy just 2 weeks ago.
If Matt Gaetz doesn't move to vacate, Buck doesn't get to vote.
That's absolutely
right.
That's
the core.
Yes.
That's the core for me.
Yes.
Is stop talking about what Buck did after the vote. What was the impetus? What was the action? For me, I hear it like people. I hear it from the Rashida Tlaibs and everybody else in the attack that Hamas that launched. That they turn around and go, but look at how horrible they had been treated by Israel, and look at this. And don't you understand that 15 years ago this happened? That, again, was 15 years ago. You're beginning to rationalize at that point, and you're trying to lessen what happened with the attack. And the idea that, well, Buck voted to vacate. He wasn't responsible for the motion to vacate. Now, he had his reasons to vacate. But you know what? If the Republicans were more of a coalesced group, you guys wouldn't have this.
Yes.
It would not happen.
If the Republicans had their literal house in order, McCarthy wouldn't have taken 15 votes and weakening his speakership by that 15th vote. With each vote getting to that point, he weakened his speakership, putting him in this position because he overpromised, underdelivered. He got tossed out, and now Buck is getting the flack because he's not supporting the guy that some folks have said needs to be the next speaker.
And let's just look at what the Democrats did when they were in power. Pelosi wasn't everybody's favorite, but she got everybody in line. And she said, this is how I'm going to lead. Then when it was time to get somebody else, it was Hakeem Jeffries. There was a little bit of discussion there, but Jeffries didn't go through any of this rigmarole. It is not Ken Buck's fault that the Republican conference in the House can't pick a leader that will get a majority of the votes.
Well,
that is on the conference.
And Bill, I didn't see the total sense. I know it went up, but when I checked earlier, there were 12 And I assume if Buck voted when his name was called, that he voted for somebody else. But there were at least 12, which is more than enough to sink it. And Buck could have voted for Jordan, and it wouldn't have made a bit of difference.
No. Again, you can lose five. And the GOP needs to stop and smell themselves and realize the stink that is beginning to emanate from the body, because over and over again, the Democrat Hakeem Jeffries is getting more votes for speaker.
Right. And to the average American who's hearing about this and doesn't pay attention to politics, then they can see and be like, wait a second, the Democrat guy got more votes than anybody else, and yet he's not the speaker. This is weird. But here's the other piece to this. Michael Barone made this point, astute observation, as he always does, in the first hour. Of course, senior political analyst for the Washington Examiner. And he pointed out that in 1998, I think it was, Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich was expecting and hoping to become the speaker. He realized after their vote behind closed doors, I don't have the votes. So he bowed out. And I think that's when Denny Hastert was put up and became the Speaker of the House.
Yeah, and
that was a political or recognition of the political situation on the ground, as it were, within the Republican caucus.
That is a great example, because let's compare and contrast that to what has been going on this past 2 weeks. We have heard through reporting that Jim Jordan challenged Scalise and said, you don't get to go to the floor and ask for a vote, or we don't get to do this unless you can guarantee you can get the 217. We shouldn't do this. This is bad form. Jordan's now gone 3 times. So what he said,
hear that. I did not hear that.
What he said was a principle to him, and saying and challenging Scalise to not go to the floor. He's now done the opposite. I'm sorry. Figure it out.
Wait. Are you saying that Jim Jordan took a principled stand in opposition to Steve Scalise and then violated his principles?
Yes, absolutely. Within days of what he said the principle is, he decided to do something different. That's an issue. That's a real issue.
But here's the thing. This isn't just about Jordan, just about McCarthy, just about Gates. There are, 217 Republicans, or however many Republicans there are. I think 217 is the number for vote. Yeah. Is it 224?
I think it's 220. Yeah.
Whatever it is. There are over and above 220 Republicans in the House who all have some responsibility for this. And it is an embarrassment to the GOP, whether you are in the so-called establishment wing, or you are an anti-establishment rebel, or your Tea Party, or your MAGA, or whatever. You should be embarrassed by the Republican Party right in this moment in the House of Representatives that can't even get a leader, while our ally Israel is at war against terrorists, and when we have the prospect of Republicans getting blamed for a government shutdown that Bill, the American people, in poll after poll, were ready to blame Biden for.
Yeah, they were ready, and now it won't happen that way. There was an interview yesterday, Fox News, I forget the Republican representative, but he said this needs to be solved behind closed doors. He said he is not taking a position on who the speaker should be. His argument is that the GOP needs to figure out what is the role and what monies do we need to allocate for Ukraine, if any? What's the role of monies and what do we allocate for Israel? What's our support there? What is the role and what are we doing as far as the budget? How do we get the budget passed through the Senate? What is going to be reasonable? Stop passing these budget spending bills that are never going to make through the Senate. What is the path forward? He says he doesn't care who that individual is, but those things need to be settled, because if they aren't settled before you get a speaker, then that becomes a public disagreement and you're not moving forward. He said we're going to face the same paralyzation we had under McCarthy.
So his suggestion was hash out the terms of discussion on those issues, then get the speaker who negotiates knowing what the Republicans have agreed on.
Yeah, like the idea of actually, I don't know, it seems silly. And maybe the Denver Broncos should think about this, but having a game plan set out on paper before you walk onto the field. And that's what he's asking for. He's asking for the Republicans to come together and have a game plan, not a list of desires and hopes and wishes and dreams and complaints. Have a plan. Understand what is possible. Understand where their leverage is, and understand what they can, and be realistic about what they can't get. And you know what? People that are sitting on the curvy couch on Fox started yelling at him, "You just need to vote!" And he's going, no, because the vote is irrelevant if once we have a speaker, regardless of the last name of that speaker, if they can't bring these issues across the finish line.
But here's the other problem, Bill, is if they can't agree on that, cannot agree to this point on a speaker, to at least get the prospect that you could have some, theoretically, bipartisan agreement in the House, where Republicans and Democrats come together on what to do with these appropriation packages, which some Republicans, moderate Republicans, may feel is necessary at a certain point because this has gone on far enough. You need to have a speaker in order to do that. So somebody could argue, let's get the speaker and then get that sorted out because we can't move ahead with any legislation until we have a speaker.
I would just
It's
say,
not good politics for the Republicans, but
I would just say that have you been watching for the past 10 months? Because that's been the plan.
Mhm.
And that has worked. How well? How well has that worked out for Republican agendas? How well did that work out with the last budget showdown?
But how is it necessarily going to be any better when, you know, you're behind closed doors? And what I'm saying is the Republicans are damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Well, here's the idea. If you behind closed doors can't come up with a game plan and a strategy that is going to be effective, you can create a strategy. It can be John Payton could create a strategy for the Broncos and say, this week, no linemen and 17 wide receivers. Not going to be effective, but it is a strategy. It's a strategy you can try. You can run out on the field and go for that. Let's see how it works out. But just having a strategy isn't necessarily workable that way. So you have to make sure that it's going to get you across the finish line. And if the GOP can't do this behind closed doors, what leads us to believe they can do it in open? And the other part is let me know why you are there, because you're not there. They're not there to get clicks on social media.
Yes.
They're not there to make speeches on Fox News or
Well,
elsewhere.
and that's the thing.
They're there to govern.
Jordan is the best when he is that sort of bulldog on television. That is not the role of a Speaker of the House. You don't get to go as chairman of the Judiciary Committee and grill a guy in front of you. When you're Speaker of the House, you got to be doing the machination. So here's the thing. They can agree behind closed doors on what to do with an Israel and Ukraine package and what their limitations are there. Speaker gets in there. And then what about the other issues? What about the other things that will crop up and you don't have a speaker who can manage that?
Yeah. And it is. And if you can't figure it out, for my money, if the GOP can't figure this out behind closed doors, go home. Stop voting. You can't govern. If you can't figure it out between the group of you, then you're worthless. There's no reason for you to exist. And there's no reason for you even to show up on Monday to do your job, because you've proven over and over again, you can't. This isn't about necessarily your principles and ideas. This is about you governing. And yeah, I'm sorry. Sometimes compromise is inevitable. And you don't believe me? Okay, let's go back to the founding fathers. Let's talk about the argument between the Federalists and non-Federalists. Talk to me about compromise. If you think that this country was not founded on compromise, you don't know your history.
This reminds me, as a New York Giants fan, of when Plaxico Burress shot himself in the foot. That's exactly what's happening. Hey, Bill, you got to text in. I nominate Billy for Speaker of the House. If nominated, Bill, please don't accept.
My mom hi.
If nominated, please do not accept that. I don't wish that on you, brother. Not even you, Bill Thorpe. We're going to take a break. Final segment on the other side. Moving along quickly, Jimmy Sengenberger in for George Brockler, 710 KNUS.
Say goodbye to clutter and hello to convenience when you experience organization transformation in your home. Roll 'em out shelves, your clutter transformation experts create affordable Colorado-crafted organized storage solutions. These custom options will maximize and organize your kitchen and bath storage as Roll 'em out shelves carefully designs and builds roll-out drawers to fit your space perfectly. To clear the clutter, contact owners Joyce and Brent at Roll 'em Out Shelves to schedule your free
Wrapping up and winding down, Jimmy Sengenberger in for George Brockler today. Back in the saddle tomorrow from 6 until 9 with the Jimmy Sengenberger Show. News Talk 710 KNUS. Jim Jordan has done worse on this ballot than before. I am not great with math, so let me do a little math. 25 Republicans have voted for others. On Tuesday, it was 20. On Wednesday, it was 22. 2 days later, after McCarthy gave his speech pitching Jordan, after Jordan himself went and did a press conference today, it's now even worse at 25. There's a high-pressure campaign that's been built from talk radio to the Colorado GOP pressuring on the buck to colleagues and Jordan's team making phone calls, doing what some Republicans have called blackmail, these strong-arming tactics, and they aren't working. People are being pushed away more and more from Jordan. This is not a positive sign. With McCarthy, when we went through the 15, he was already winning votes, slowly but surely. Jim Jordan is losing votes. I like Jordan. Cool with him as speaker. Been saying that these past couple days. But if you can't add to your coalition and instead are subtracting from it, that ain't a good sign for leadership. And the problem with Washington, D.C. right now, more than anything else, with politics in general, is the massive egos of those in office, even as the world seems to crumble beside us. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. In tomorrow morning again from 6 to 9. You got Deborah Flora and then Stephen Tubbs all starting at 3, continuing live and local conversations. I'll see you tomorrow morning. Have a great weekend, and may God bless America.